Up here, the blue line is where the Wachumna lived. The Wachumna lived in what was called Four Creeks, or Three Rivers. Underneath the Kauai Reservoir are remnants of an Indian village that was there for over 5,000 years. And before that reservoir was created, the University of California, Berkeley came up here and did a quick dig to pull out as many artifacts as they could. But most of those artifacts are still under that water up there. And it was where a tribe lived there, and why would they move when they had the water coming down the hill, and the deer coming down the hill, and the acorns, the fish, and everything? It was a perfect place to live. Up north here were the Chowchilla. The Chowchilla lived between the Kings River and the San Joaquin River, or even further north up to the Fresno River, and they were like a plains Indian. And what they did was they followed the elk and the deer and the antelope, and they wandered out here throughout the seasons. And then what I did here with the green is to show roughly where the Yokuts lived, and they lived around the Tulare Lake. In the middle of all three of these places, I circled this little place in pink. Now what is that? What do you think that is? Well, we're going to see. Here is a map from 1927 of the Kings River that started off up here where Riverland is, and the two branches that flowed down. But I'm really interested in this little peninsula right here. We'll zoom in even further. It's Burrs Park. Burrs Park is a park because the Burrs family recognized the importance of that area to the local tribes. That's why they never developed it. They gave it to the county as a park for particular reasons. Around this park, you would not realize, but there are many Indian burial sites there that have never been touched. They just leave them alone. What made this as an interesting place was because it was on a peninsula, this little finger of land was green all year long. And so all three of the tribes, the Chowchilla, the Wachumna, and the Tachi, would all meet here at the end of August, around the beginning of fall, and they'd spend weeks here trading and celebrating and marrying and doing everything else. And I spoke to several tribal members who told me that when their grandparents were little kids, so we were talking about the 1840s, 1850s, that the kids used to wander out the river to go look for the water dogs. And I was like, well, water dog? And the only thing they could think of, they didn't know what their grandparents were saying, so they were thinking it was either otters or seals, because they would bark. And so that's what they would go look for, the water dogs. And you know, I tell that to some people, and of course they go roll their eyes. And I was like, well, you don't know what was here. Again, it was the Garden of Eden. There could have been so many, there was so much wildlife and so many species of animals we don't even know existed. They're gone. We don't even know what they were. So Burrs Park has a lot of significance to the tribe. It's a very sacred place for them. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and I always wondered where it got the name from. There was a villa down in Mexico City called Guadalupe Hidalgo where they actually signed the treaty. I don't even think the villa's there anymore, it's just a neighborhood. But what that did was, that was the end of the Mexican-American War, and you see here all this red was what was given up by Mexico, which included the Tulare Lake Basin. And that was the change. That was the moment in which things began to change. Now, the Spaniards came here in the early 1700s and the mid 1700s, and they had a lot of influence on the coastal tribes. But the tribes of the Central Valley were pretty much unmolested because, again, when you came over the hill, looking down at the valley, what you saw was this gigantic 600 square mile swamp. And who's going to want to walk through that? So there were tribes. The people that lived out here were just relatively left alone because, again, geography would preclude anybody from wanting to come down here. So what happened was that from 1848 to 1850, whenever California became a state, there was a discussion as to, well, what do we do about the Indians that are here? And there were a lot of different discussions. So one of the first laws passed by the state of California was the an act for the government and protection of Indians, which I'm going to say was an oxymoron, okay? Because protection should be in quotation marks. I'm going to read you some of this stuff. Any person having or herewith obtaining a minor Indian shall give to such person a certificate authorizing him or her to have the care, custody, control, and earnings of such minor until he or she obtains the age of majority. So basically, if you were able to grab yourself an Indian kid, you had a slave until that person turned majority. And there was a slave market in California between the 1850s and the 1870s down in Los Angeles that dealt exclusively with Indians. It is really sad when you think about it. Again, this is stuff that you're really disappointed in hearing about and reading about, but you have to face up to the fact that this stuff did happen. Furthermore, when an Indian is convicted of an offense before a justice of the peace, punishable by a fine, any white person may, by consent of the judge, give bond for said Indian, conditioned for the payment of said fine and coats, and in such case, the Indian shall be compelled to work for that person, so he has been discharged by his bail. So again, what you're able to do is, the Indian gets arrested, you pay his bond, and he becomes your slave to work the bond off. How long would it take? I don't know. Maybe never. Any Indian able to work or support himself in some honest calling, not having wherewithal to maintain himself, who shall be found loitering and strolling about, or frequently public places where liquors are sold, begging or leading an immoral or profane course of life, shall be liable to be arrested on the complaint of any resident citizen of the county and brought before any justice of peace of the proper county. And he would be authorized and require the officer having him in charge or custody to hire him out, such a vagrant, within 24 hours of the best bidder, by public notice, given that he shall direct for the highest price that can be had for any terms not exceeding 4 months. So, again, this was legal trading of Native Americans in California. As I said, Indian protection, right, okay? Here's our governor, Peter Hardman Burnett. On January 6, 1851, at his State of the State address to the California Senate, first governor, Peter Burnett, said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. And it's like, yeah, this guy was our first governor. You think Gavin Newsom was bad, okay? Yeah, and so I was like, well, who in the heck was this guy? So I did a little reading on him, okay? In 1843, Burnett had led a wagon train to Oregon. He was elected to the legislature where he took the lead in passing a law that excluded African Americans from the state. The law allowed whites to keep their slaves for 3 years, after which they would be freed and required to leave. Any black person who refused to leave would be whipped, earning the nickname of Peter Hardman Burnett's Lash Law. It was rescinded the next year. And so this is a picture of him painted by William F. Cogswell in 1879. He was a board of director for some bank in the Bay Area. Yeah, he was an interesting guy. More about, I'm not going to waste any more breath on him. He's just an interesting guy. So in 1848, Treaty of Hidalgo Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and so California was trying to figure out what to do with the Indians, and finally the federal government said, you guys got to figure something out. We just can't let these people run around here anymore. We have to do a treaty with them. So in 1851, Colonel Barber, I can't remember his name right now, I'll come up in a minute, he went to Fort Miller, and this is the Fort Barber built in 1851. This is up by Millerton, this would have been under Millerton Lake now. This fort was moved to Roding Park sometime in the 1930s, and it sat there for many years, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And then the Table Mountain tribe took it, and they've completely restored it, and they're making that a tribal cultural center, because this is where the Barber Treaties were signed. And the Barber Treaties treaty made and concluded at Camp Belt on Kings River in the state of California between George Barber, Commissioner of the Part of the United States, and chiefs, captains, and headmen of the Tachis, Kawal, etc., tribes of the Indians. It talks about what they're going to get if they give up their rights to the land. They're going to get cattle, they're going to get food, they're going to get supplies every year. And then it goes on, it says in here, where Barber had a seal, and all the different tribal members had their seals. And so when I started working for the tribe, I said, hey, you guys have a copy of your treaty? And they kind of look at me kind of funny, like, what do you mean? And they basically pulled out this book. They had this, I go, no, the actual treaty, the one that was written and signed at Camp Barber. And they go, no, we have no idea where that's at. And so I made a few calls, and from the National Archives, I got copies of the original treaty. Now, unfortunately, this is before so this happened in the early 1990s. This was before people even had scanners. The email didn't really exist. So I was happy to get a photocopy of the treaty. I don't know if I'd be able to get a scan of it today. It'd be wonderful. But this is the same thing. It says Treaty at Camp Belt. Everything that I read from the beginning is all in handwriting, okay? And then went in here as to what they're going to get. It's all handwritten out, talking about the cattle and the beef and everything like that. And then what's really important is here's the actual marks. His mark right there, all the X's. All the different X's there are showing the marks of all the different tribes that were signing. And so it was really interesting to see that, to see how it was. And so what was going to happen was, this was how it was going to work. It was called the 18 Treaties of Camp Barber. And what you have here is the white area is where all the tribes, that was their domain, and then the dark gray areas where they were going to end up living. If they gave away all the other stuff, they got to keep the gray stuff. And so the Tachis were going to get to Tulare Lake right there. And so what happened was, between the time they signed the treaty and the time the treaty got back to Washington, there was a lot of clamoring by the people over in California saying, hey, wait a minute, they're getting the best land. We don't want you to ratify that. And so here is the actual ratification denial. Resolve that the Senate do not advise and consent to the ratification of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship at Camp Belt. So this is July 8th, 1852. This is the actual Senate saying, nope, not gonna ratify it. Sorry. And this put the tribes of California it put them in limbo. Wait, we were willing to give up everything, just keep a little bit, and you guys can't even have that? And so what happened? Well, let's see. I'm going to get off the subject a little bit. Artificial intelligence, this is not an ad, okay? Artificial intelligence has really come a long ways when it comes to researching old newspapers. And if you have a computer and you type in a certain term and you're looking at a certain edition of a newspaper, it'll tell you everywhere where that term shows up. So what I did was I got on newspapers.com and I just started typing in specific words, and I came up with these fabulous articles that I think I'm blowing the dust off of them. The earliest one here is from the San Joaquin Republican. That was up from Tracy area, or not Tracy, Stockton. And this was from 1852. And it says, some few days since, the chief and several of his men came across Kings River and ordered a gentleman by the name of Campbell, who had established a ferry across the river, to take down his ferry rope, stating that the country belongs to his people and he did not want the Americans to cross the Kings River. He gave Campbell 2 days to leave the river. And so this guy came running to some city, I think Visalia, and actually went up to Millerton, and he said, hey, they're kicking me off my ferry. So they sent out some men down there to have a friendly talk, and then it didn't turn out friendly. They ended up shooting each other. And so what happened was that we thought better at this juncture to convince them that we were ready for war if they desired it, and opened fire upon them. So basically, the white guy shot first. And he said, well, they were going to do it to us, okay? In 1853, this is a report from the Indian Commissioner talking about I now turn to the condition of the Indians in California and the necessity of doing something for their relief and protection. Their condition is truly deplorable. Driven from their hunting and fishing grounds, in danger of starving, many of them made to work entirely without compensation, and continual massacres going on. This new mode of oppression of the Indians, if catching them like cattle and making them work and turning them out to starve and die when their work season is over. So what was happening was that the tribes were being basically treated like cattle in many respects, and this was one of the newspaper articles that talked about it. Further on, these Indians were offered by their captors to the farmers in the neighborhood to hire at $1 a day, but that price was considered too high for the being so low in flesh, and rather than lower the price, they were allowed to starve as reported. It is a common practice, and I know it to be such, to catch Indian children when they are out gathering acorns and take them and hold them as slaves. So this is happening right after the Treaty of Campbell, the Barber Treaties, was not ratified. 1856, San Joaquin Republican. Millerton near Fort Miller. Editor, I have just time to say that the Fort Creek Indians are going to work in earnest. The Indians have commenced burning down and plundering the houses of the inhabitants while the men are out hunting them down. Volunteers will leave here today for Tulare, and Mr. Poindexter came to town. A field howitzer was set up. They said, we're up a cannon to fight the Indians. 25 men left here this morning to the seat for the seat of war, for the scat of war. 1858. Between the San Joaquin and Kings River, I met a body of citizens from the Lake County driving and hauling some 200 Lake and Lower Kings River Indians to the reservation on the Fresno. The Indians, it is said, have been killing hogs and cattle to a considerable